This episode is not about a single failure. It's about a pattern that appears inside large systems when problems are identified early, documented clearly, and escalated correctly. Yet nothing changes. Over time, the system doesn't collapse. It adapts. Temporary fixes stop being temporary. Workarounds harden. Failure becomes routine. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how that happens, and why systems that look stable on the surface can be failing quietly underneath. Institutions are built to survive disruption, not to enjoy it. When a process breaks, the first instinct is rarely to redesign the system. The first instinct is to keep it moving, keep services running, keep outputs steady, keep the public-facing surface intact, so the response arrives as a patch, a manual step added to an automated workflow, an exception granted for now, a workaround written into an operating note, a staffing gap covered with overtime, a maintenance cycle stretched just a little longer, a definition quietly loosened so the numbers still look acceptable. None of this feels like surrender. It feels like competence under pressure. A temporary fix is attractive because it offers three things at once: speed, deniability, and continuity. It can be deployed without a reorg, without new funding, without admitting the original design is failing. Most importantly, it prevents visible collapse today. And in institutions, preventing collapse today often outranks preventing collapse later. At first, the temporary fix is treated as a bridge. Everyone talks about the real solution that will follow. There are plans, timelines, roadmaps, and a meeting scheduled for next month to discuss the next meeting. But the system keeps operating, and as days turn into weeks, the fix proves something dangerous. The institution can function without solving the underlying problem. Not well, not safely, not elegantly, but enough. Enough to hit minimum service, enough to avoid scandal, enough to move the crisis off the front page. That enough is the turning point. Because once a workaround is survivable, the pressure to remove it collapses. The institution begins to treat the patch as a feature rather than a flaw. Documentation updates. Training materials include the new step. Teams build schedules around the workaround. No one calls it temporary because doing so would reintroduce urgency. Urgency is expensive. To remove a workaround, you need coordination. You need downtime. You need a willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term stability. You need leadership that can survive the political cost of admitting the system isn't working as designed. Most institutions don't have that luxury. They have deadlines, headlines, and quarterly reporting. They have angry stakeholders and shrinking budgets. They have a constant incentive to postpone disruptive repair until conditions are better. And conditions are never better. So the temporary fix stays through the next budget cycle, then the next. Each time it survives another season, it gains legitimacy. People stop asking when it will be removed and start asking how to optimize it. The conversation shifts from "how do we fix this" to "how do we make this manageable?" That shift is where temporary fixes become permanent systems, not through a decision, but through accumulation. The workaround becomes embedded in enough routines that removing it now feels like removing a load-bearing wall. Even if everyone agrees it's wrong, no one can picture the building without it. By the time the institution realizes the fix is no longer temporary, it's already living inside the new design. And once a workaround becomes design, it stops being questioned. It stops being counted as a deviation. It becomes the baseline the system measures itself against, the new normal, quietly installed. The most reliable way to make a temporary fix permanent is to plan around it. Planning turns exceptions into assumptions. Once a workaround exists, schedules adjust to accommodate it. Budgets quietly absorb its cost. Performance targets are recalculated so the degraded process still meets expectations. What began as an emergency measure becomes part of the official rhythm of the institution. This is where the language changes. Early on, people say, "Until we solve this." Later they say, "Given the current constraints." The problem is no longer framed as a fault to eliminate, but as a condition to operate within. That framing is seductive because it sounds mature. It sounds realistic. It sounds like leadership. But it carries a hidden message. We have stopped believing improvement is possible. The longer the workaround persists, the more it reshapes incentives. A manager who keeps things running with a patch is rewarded for stability. A manager who attempts deep repair creates disruption, delays output, and attracts scrutiny. In a risk-averse institution, stability is safer than reform, even if stability is built on failure. So people optimize for the survivable version of broken. Teams create specialized roles to manage the workaround. A temporary manual check becomes a permanent job. A short-term spreadsheet becomes a critical database. A one-off exception becomes a standard operating procedure with its own training module, compliance checklist, and audit trail. Now the workaround has stakeholders. Someone's workload depends on it. Someone's budget line depends on it. Someone's team exists because the fix exists. The institution begins to defend the patch not because it's good, but because removing it would destabilize the internal economy it has created. This is how failure gains constituency. And once it does, the original problem becomes harder to solve, because solving it would destroy the new structure built around not solving it. There is also the simplest force of all: familiarity. When new staff arrive, they inherit the workaround as reality. They learn the system through the patched version, not the original design. To them, the extra steps are not evidence of decay. They are just how it works. If someone mentions that it used to be simpler, it sounds like nostalgia, not diagnosis. This is how temporary fixes become generational. Institutional memory shifts from purpose to procedure. The organization forgets what normal looked like. Standards that once defined success become myths. Stories told by older staff who eventually leave. Meanwhile, the cost of reversal rises. Every year the workaround remains, more dependencies form. Other units adapt in response. Downstream systems are configured to expect the patched output. Vendors build around the new process. Regulators audit against the degraded procedure because it's the only one that exists on paper. By the time someone proposes returning to the original standard, the proposal is treated as radical. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. It threatens the entire network of adaptations that have grown up around the workaround. So leadership does what leadership often does in mature decline. It commissions a review. The review identifies what everyone already knows. It recommends long-term reform. It assigns the work to a committee with no authority over budgets or staffing. The institution signals seriousness while keeping its day-to-day operations untouched. And because the workaround continues to function, the review satisfies the emotional need for action. The system gets to feel responsible without changing. The patch remains. The real solution moves to the horizon. This is not incompetence. It is the logic of survival inside constraint. The institution is choosing the option that minimizes immediate pain, even if it multiplies future risk. That choice repeats until it stops feeling like a choice at all. Once a workaround hardens, it begins to distort accountability. In a healthy system, failure is visible because deviation is clear. A process either meets its standard or it doesn't. When temporary fixes become permanent, the standard is no longer the reference point. The workaround is. The organization measures itself against the patched version, and the original mandate fades into the background. This has a strange effect. The system can fail without anyone breaking rules. People follow procedure. They meet the revised targets. They comply with the updated guidance, and yet the institution drifts further from its purpose. Because the purpose is no longer being measured, only the process is. Audits reinforce this drift. Auditors check whether the documented procedure is followed. If it is, compliance is recorded as success. The deeper question, whether the procedure should exist at all, is outside the scope. The workaround becomes self-validating because it is now the documented reality. Meanwhile, responsibility diffuses. Who owns the underlying problem once everyone has adapted to it? The unit that first applied the patch? The department that never funded the permanent fix? The leadership team that postponed disruption? In a complex organization, the answer becomes everyone and no one. So the workaround becomes nobody's fault and everybody's job. This is one reason it lasts. Systems can tolerate a lot of failure as long as accountability is unclear. When no single actor can be blamed, no single actor has the power to correct. The organization lives inside the gap between responsibility and authority. Over time, even risk perception changes. The institution survives another month with the workaround in place, then another year. Each survival becomes proof that the degraded state is stable. Near misses are treated as stress tests passed. The system begins to believe it has resilience because it has endurance. Endurance is not resilience, but the difference disappears once the workaround becomes baseline. As the workaround becomes permanent, it also consumes the buffers that once protected the system. Extra capacity is redirected to keep the patch running. Redundancy is cannibalized. Maintenance is deferred because attention is spent managing exceptions. People become skilled at improvisation, and that skill is mistaken for safety. The institution looks calm because it has learned how to operate in emergency mode quietly. But the calm is artificial. The system is not healthy. It is compensated. Compensated systems are brittle. They can appear stable right up until the moment a small additional shock overwhelms the last remaining margin. And because the system has been operating without margin for so long, it cannot recognize how close it is to the edge. This is where warnings lose their power. When staff raise concerns about the workaround, leadership hears something familiar. We've been doing this for years. The fact that the patch is dangerous becomes less persuasive the longer the patch has existed. If it were truly dangerous, the reasoning goes, it would have already failed catastrophically. So the risk is reclassified from urgent to chronic. Chronic risks are the easiest to ignore because they do not demand immediate decision. They can be managed, tracked, reviewed, and deferred. They become part of the institution's background noise. The workaround, once meant to prevent failure, now helps normalize it. And the more the organization normalizes it, the harder it becomes to reverse, because reversing it would require admitting that years of management were not solutions at all, merely delay. Institutions hate admitting delay because delay implies choice. And if it was a choice, someone is accountable. So the institution chooses the safer story. This is just how the environment is. These are just the constraints. The workaround is not a symptom of decline. It is proof of pragmatism. That story keeps the system stable right up until it breaks. Eventually, the system forgets that the workaround was ever temporary. Documentation reflects the new reality. Training assumes it. Metrics encode it. New policies are written around it. The patch becomes an official pathway, not an exception. At that point, removing it feels less like repair and more like redesign. And redesign carries political risk. So the institution delays again, not because leaders can't see the problem, but because the short-term cost of correction is visible, while the long-term cost of delay remains abstract. Deep repair requires downtime, investment, and public admission that the system is operating below standard. Keeping the workaround requires none of that. It only requires continuation. Continuation is almost always easier to defend. Over time, the workaround becomes the system's real operating model. The original design still exists in manuals and mission statements, but not in practice. People stop asking when the real fix will happen because they stop believing it will. This is where decline becomes self-sustaining. The institution begins to treat the workaround as the evidence that it is coping. Leaders describe it as resilience. Teams are praised for making it work. Emergency measures are reframed as innovation. The organization tells itself a story in which adaptation is success. And adaptation can look like success, right up until it fails. When the workaround finally breaks, the failure appears sudden from the outside. Services halt. Backlogs spike. A small error cascades. The system that seemed stable reveals itself as fragile. Observers ask how something so fundamental could have been allowed to persist. Inside the institution, the collapse feels less like surprise and more like inevitability. Because people knew the patch was carrying too much weight. They knew the margins were gone. They knew the fix was never meant to last. They simply lived inside a system that rewarded postponement and punished disruption. Afterward, there will be investigations. They will find the same pattern every time. Temporary measures extended repeatedly, permanent solutions deferred, risks documented, warnings issued, and decisions postponed until the cost of delay became unavoidable. All of it will be true. But the deeper failure will be simpler. The institution did not ignore the problem. It responded to it in the fastest, least disruptive way available. And then it kept responding the same way until the response became the design. That is how temporary fixes become permanent systems, not through collapse, but through survival. This is why reform attempts so often fail at this stage. External reviewers arrive with recommendations that assume capacity the institution no longer has. They assume slack, redundancy, and room to maneuver. But the workaround has consumed those things. The system is operating at its limit, and anything that interrupts output feels intolerable. So reforms are accepted in principle and neutralized in practice. Commitments are made with no budgets attached. Timelines are announced with no staffing behind them. Accountability is assigned to offices that can coordinate but cannot compel. The institution produces the appearance of change while protecting the habits that keep it functioning today. Meanwhile, the workaround continues to age. Manual steps become error-prone. People improvise shortcuts. Documentation falls behind reality. The patchwork expands, layer after layer, until no one fully understands how the system is held together. The institution operates by habit and inherited workarounds, not by design. When failure finally breaks through, it is rarely the original problem that destroys the system. It is the accumulation. A patch depends on another patch. An exception relies on another exception. A small disruption arrives, a staffing shortage, a supplier delay, a spike in demand, and suddenly there is nowhere for the pressure to go. The system has no slack left. It cannot bend. It can only fracture. And when it fractures, the institution will describe the event as extraordinary. It will call it unforeseeable. But the truth is that it was not extraordinary at all. It was the predictable outcome of a system that replaced correction with accommodation again and again until accommodation became permanent. The temporary fix did what it was designed to do. It prevented collapse today. What it could never do was prevent collapse forever.